Hello, hello. Oh, hello, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. How are y'all doing? How's the traffic or lack thereof?
A lack is good.
Given lack thereof. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this dreary Monday. We hope we can make it a little bit better. I will start with some introductions. But first, I really just want to welcome you to our event, Beyond the Beach. Just talking about offshore wind. This really was born out of a need. We had a lot of folks coming to us saying, I really want to learn more about offshore wind. It seems like everything's either all the way over here or all the way over here. So we wanted to give folks the facts from a variety of sources, and hopefully you leave here learning something. Go and spread the information. Some housekeeping, as you all saw before you sat down, there are some note cards on your seats. There's gonna be some chances, the latter 40 minutes or so of our event, we're gonna have a chance to answer some of your questions. Fair warning, they're not gonna be verbatim. What we're gonna do after the panelists are done with the questions that we've prepared, we're going to give you a chance to get up and stretch and talk a little bit, maybe go to the bathroom, get some water. And while you're doing that, we're going to be compiling the questions. So I ask that when you write your question, you put kind of a couple words of like what it's about. Is it about economic impact? Is it about wildlife? Is it about energy infrastructure? Just put like a couple words at the top about what it is and kind of make sure you keep it kind of brief. We only have 40 minutes, hoping to get through a couple questions for you all. And so after that, we'll have a chance to answer your questions. And then we'll be off. I am your MC, and a fair warning, not that I take no crap, but I take very little of it. So I ask that y'all keep it cute. I see that we are all adults here, a lot of young adults in the room, so I'm hoping that we can keep this respectful. If you have any issues, we can talk about it outside, but we will not talk about it in here. Does everyone hear what I'm saying? Picking up what I'm putting down. I appreciate y'all for keeping this cute. We're in the beautiful Lewis Public Library. I see libraries as a sacred space not to be messed with, and I hope you all see it the same way. So now that that's out the way, how are y'all feeling about today? Thumbs up, thumbs middle. Ooh, so thumbs up. I'm excited. All right. Well, my name is Marissa McClinton. I am the Environmental Justice Associate Organizer for the Sierra Club Delaware chapter. I do a lot of our policy work for the Sierra Club, make sure that it is adhering to our principles of equity and environmental justice. And that is me. So with that, I'm going to pass it down to our presenters to give them a chance to introduce themselves.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Christophe Toulouse. I'm the Executive Director of the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. We're one of 28 estuaries of national significance around the country, and we take care of, restore, protect, preserve the inland bays here in Delaware. So if you go to the beach and you're heading south, you look off to the right, that's what we're taking care of. So anyway, that's our role. Obviously very interested in offshore wind.
Hi, my name is Mike Dunmeyer. I am the outreach guy in Delaware for US Wind, and I live a couple blocks from here, so thank you very much for this wonderful location. If you don't know, US Wind is a project, 80,000 acre lease area, primarily off the coast of Maryland, but we're looking to connect to the grid here in Sussex County. We'll have a chance to talk about it as we move forward, but we've won awards that would enable us to develop about 1,700 megawatts of offshore wind, and we can do that with 114 turbines and 4 offshore substations. Take all your questions as we get into it. This way.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate you coming out to learn a little bit about offshore wind. My name is Evan Vaughn. I'm Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Coalition, or MERIC Action for short. We are effectively trade association that represents about 50 utility-scale wind, solar, and battery storage developers that are active in the regional PJM grid, which covers 13 states. So in leading this organization, I advocate for policies that grow those clean energy industries all the way from Ohio to New Jersey, down to Virginia, back up through Kentucky. So I bring a regional perspective to this. I'm going to speak a little bit today about the regional electricity grid, why electricity rates are going up in Delaware, and some of the things that and ways that offshore wind can help be a solution for those problems. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, pretty central to that whole region that I cover, and it's really great to be out here and to talk to you all. US Wind is one of our member companies and board members.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Swallow with Delaware Sea Grant. I'm based at the campus in Lewis, just down the road, and I am a coastal hazard specialist. I work with communities to help them prepare and understand changes to our weather and climate. Sea Grant is an organization that utilizes education and technical assistance and funds research to support efforts to make communities more resilient and our fisheries and our environment more sustainable. We don't take positions on pending projects or policies. What we try to do is just connect people to science-based information so that we can help facilitate discussions on those topics. And I'm very happy to be here today.
All right, so we.
Can I just get the gentleman to talk a little slower?
Yes, you can. Gentlemen, please talk a little slower. Of course. So we heard a little bit about them and they zoomed through it, so I'm gonna turn on y'all. I just want to get a feeling for how familiar folks are with offshore wind. So if this is like you're completely new, you know nothing, raise your hand. Okay. If you know enough that like you can kind of understand, but you really don't know the nitty-gritties, raise your hand. Okay. If you think you can teach me about offshore wind, raise your hand. My 4 panelists. Yes, thank you. All right, so we're gonna jump right into it. So there have been a lot of questions about how bringing cables in through the inland bays will impact wildlife and the ecology in the area. The Center for Inland Bays commented on the permits for the onshoring process and made recommendations, along with other environmental groups, to help reduce impacts. So my question for you, Christoph, do you think there are overall more negative or positive impacts to bringing offshore wind online with the onshoring process? And do you expect any long-term impacts from the lines for construction?
Thank you for the question, Marissa. And just to reiterate, so the Center for the Inland Bays is concerned about our inland bays. And so our focus is from the beach westward. And so we are concerned about things that would affect those bays, the wetlands, the uplands that surround them. So the entire watershed, which is about 400 square miles. And it does include Dagsboro, which is where the power plant currently exists, and where it is that US Wind proposes to connect the power cables that come from the offshore wind turbines to the grid so that the electricity that flows from that offshore wind development can flow into all of our sockets and charge up our iPhones. So at any rate, so that's what we focused on. And so our concern and interest is primarily very parochial. And when the company decided that its preferred option was to bring those power cables from those turbines through the ocean underneath 3 R's Beach, just south of the inlet, some of you may be familiar with it, and then in a trench through the Indian River Bay to Dagsboro, we obviously got very, very interested. And so we asked our Science and Technical Advisory Committee, which advises us on science and technical issues, surprisingly, to take a look at this. And what they did is reviewed past projects. They looked at the potential impacts associated with this particular project. And we developed a set of comments, which we then shared with the federal regulatory agency, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is part of the Department of the Interior in Washington. And also then ultimately with the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control here in Delaware, more affectionately known to us here in Sussex County as DENREC. And so we've had the opportunity to look at those issues in some detail and review the project plans. So our response is basically twofold. The first part is looking very carefully at the environmental impact statement that the federal agency was putting together to describe impacts and to take a look at what the potential long-term implications would be. And their findings were that there would be impacts. As you can imagine, digging through the bottom of the bay is going to kick up sediment. It's going to do a lot of things that could disrupt what life is there. But what they did determine is that those impacts would be short-term and not very widespread. And so our analysis pretty much confirmed that, but what we have suggested to the regulatory agencies is prove it. So do the monitoring that would be necessary to give all of us the confidence that what the environmental impact statement and what the company are asserting are going to be short-term impacts are indeed short-term impacts. And so that monitoring shouldn't take a whole long time, because if it's short-term, it's short-term. If it's long-term, then you monitor until we find out what's really going on out there. And that's associated with impacts associated with the hydrojetting or the trenching of the bays with dredging that might be required in certain places, any potential impacts with electromagnetic fields coming from the cables themselves, which is a concern to a lot of people. And there may be impacts on the benthic community, the little critters that are on the bottom of the bays. And so we've asked that those be monitored as well. And as Mike can explain and others, the cables are extremely well insulated. They would be under at least 6 feet of sediment in the bottom. So we're assured that those impacts are going to be also very minor, if any at all. But we need to have that confirmed as well. So anyway, that's the nature of our review, the nature of our involvement in that portion of the project. I will say this, and how many of you live in the Inland Bays watershed, in Rehoboth, Bethany, wherever, somewhere in the neighborhood? We have to be collectively very concerned about the uniqueness of our situation here. We're at the lowest lying portion of the lowest lying state in the country. And so whatever it is that might be happening out there that is causing the water to creep up our streets and into our crawl spaces, sometimes during storms, unfortunately now, sometimes even when it's sunny out, we need to be aware that that's happening. And one of the reasons it's happening is because our climate is changing. Our climate is changing because we're blanketing the earth with the results of fossil fuel burning, which is warming our atmosphere, warming the water, causing it to expand, and creating a real potential problem, actually a real problem for us here in the Inland Bays. So we support renewable energy, and we support it when it's done responsibly. So just because it's renewable energy doesn't mean it's perfect and a godsend. It's very important, but it needs to be done right. And that's basically what we were suggesting to the regulatory agency.
Perfect. So what I'm hearing, you're saying that impacts that you are seeing are going to be short-term, not widespread. You want folks to really prove it with some good reviews. Amazing. So I want to touch on what you kind of ended that with. You're talking about this force that's causing the water to kind of creep up. There's some bells going off in my mind. So my question is, what role does climate change play, if any, in determining the balance of any environmental impacts related to offshore wind or other renewable resources?
And that's the balance, right? You look at what the local impacts are, and you say, how do they measure compared to this concern about being the lowest part of the state of the country? I think the balance of the equity is, let's get a project like this, which is going to produce enough energy to power well over 1 million homes with electricity, and do that instead of continuing the operation of coal-fired power plants or the generation of power through natural gas, which, even though it's much more efficient than coal, is still a greenhouse gas. So what comes out of the stack is the stuff that creates the blanket, which is the thing that warms our atmosphere, which in turn causes our water to rise and makes our storms more powerful. All the things that we just as soon not have to endure here. So that, I would say, we are very concerned about climate change. It's really our #1 focus and #1 concern at this point.
Alrighty. So moving on a little bit into kind of the economic realm. So I know there have been numerous conversations and some confusion about how it's possible that Delaware can benefit from energy projects from our nearby states. In this case, we have an offshore wind project being initiated by the state of Maryland. So my question is, what kind of economic impacts would Delaware see, even given that Maryland is technically the state that the contract related to this project? Did that make sense, Link?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good going, Link. Okay.
So great question. And first of all, it's important to understand that the contract that U.S. Wind has with Maryland is to sell the overwhelming majority of the renewable energy credits to the state. The energy itself that's produced by the project will be sold into the PJM grid and available for use by people in Delaware and in Maryland, and frankly, in the region. So that in and of itself will have great impact for Delaware ratepayers at a lower cost.
What is the PJM grid?
Well, so there are, 4 regional grids in the United States. PJM is a 14-state grid plus the District of Columbia. Delaware is a part of that grid. PJM is the grid manager. that make sure that supply matches demand throughout all of the states that are a part of that grid. Okay, so we all contribute, we all take from. But beyond the impact on ratepayer costs, U.S. Wind is going to make a number of investments in the state. So first of all, in order to make connection to the grid possible, we'll invest $400 million in strengthening the grid here in Delaware. And so when a utility does that, typically they pass on those costs to the ratepayers. But in this case, U.S. Wind will foot the whole bill. So at the end of this, Delaware is going to wind up with a much stronger, more resilient, reliable grid at no cost. And of course, there'll be a lot of jobs created for local electrical workers as a result of that investment to do that important work for the couple of years it'll take to do that. U.S. Wind has also agreed to invest $40 million with the state of Delaware on coastal dredging projects, clean energy workforce development programs, and coastal resiliency projects for state parks. We've agreed to invest $50 million in projects around Indian River Bay, and about $15 million of that will be to fund research that will address some of the things that Christoph was talking about, making sure that the critical species that are in this area are not being negatively impacted by other cables in Indian River Bay or any of the other effects of the project. The balance of that, the other $35 million, will be on improving or creating new resources in and around the bays for things like aquaculture, fisheries, and just general park resources. U.S. Wind will be giving 150,000 free renewable energy credits to Delaware every year for 20 years. That's got a $76 million value, and we'll be paying $25 million in lease payments to the state. So all in, that's almost $600 million of investments in spending in Delaware from the project. And then beyond that, there's also going to be a decent amount of job creation. So we are engaging with a number of Delaware companies to be a part of our construction supply chain. We've already done work with a couple of engineering firms here and with the University of Delaware. And we've got dozens of local companies that are in our hopper and are eligible to be a part of that supply chain. We'll also be building an operations and maintenance facility nearby. The recommended spot was in the West Ocean City Harbor, and that may happen. That's not in Delaware, but of course close enough for someone to drive down to from this area. But we also have a couple backup spots, and we're looking at some along the Delaware Bay as well. So in any case, there will be an O&M facility in the area. That'll be about 150 permanent positions there as well. There's a ripple effect to all of that investment of additional dollars spent. So I think this can be a real boon for the local economy and an opportunity for a lot of folks to engage and be a part of this project.
Okay, it won't work.
All right, so I'm hearing strengthening the grid, I'm hearing jobs, I'm hearing economic development. Know that we've been hearing a lot recently about the transmission system. So you talk about strengthening the grid. We've heard a lot about the transmission system, and energy systems in general driving up costs for ratepayers in Delaware and indeed across the region. So Evan, I'm hoping, could you give a 3-minute version of how the energy system, transmission system, distribution system work, and how projects like this one coming online will reduce the strain on our energy system in Delaware, even though, like I said earlier, it's technically not our project.
Sure thing. It's a great question. I'll do my best to keep this to 3 minutes. This might be good fodder for Q&A cards for the second half, so I'll just put that out there. As Mike was saying, Delaware is part of, pretty central to the PJM grid, this 13-state plus DC, essentially machine that keeps supply and demand in almost pinpoint balance 24/7, 365. So anytime you turn on a light switch, do anything, this may be basic to some of you, but it's worth remembering, that small action does have an impact on the regional grid. And that grid operator, PJM, has to ensure that there are enough electrons flowing into the grid to meet the demand of your homes, businesses, public services, et cetera. And so some of you may have noticed, I'm curious, quick show of hands, have folks noticed their electricity bills going up, since the start of the year? Yeah, I know I have. In Maryland, it's much the same as it is here. And there's a number of reasons for that, but fundamentally, it's a matter of supply and demand. And when you think about supply and demand on a minute-to-minute basis, like PJM has to do, it's not just that. They also have to think about it on a year-to-year basis. And so your bills went up this winter time, in part due to that imbalance of supply and demand, but it's going to get worse, unfortunately. The fact that there are retiring legacy power plants, coal, some natural gas, some nuclear, is not quite matching the amount of new energy that's coming onto the grid across that 13-state region. And that story is very much exacerbated here in Delaware, where you don't have a lot of electricity generation. You import most of your power from out of state. And so how do rates go up? Well, it's a factor of those power plants retiring, but it's also a factor of new demand. Folks are electrifying their homes. That's part of it. Electric vehicles, that's part of it. But the biggest part of it is manufacturing and data centers. You've all heard the data center story. PJM is forecasted to need 70,000 additional megawatts of generation, electricity generation, over the next 15 years. To put that in context, 1,000 megawatts of electricity generation is a large nuclear power plant or a coal plant. So you're looking at 70 of those essentially. That is the scope of demand that is being forecast in PJM. Now, you're not, the primary driver for those data centers. Some of them you use. We all have phones in our pockets, but AI is another aspect. Some of us are using that more and more. Realizing hard to keep the 3 minutes, but hopefully this is interesting stuff because it does impact you. But I'll try to keep it brief. So the only way to make sure that your prices don't keep going up is to add more supply to the grid, essentially, or to curb demand. But that's a harder thing for you to influence here in Delaware because you can't control what other states in the region do when it comes to data centers and so on. So adding more generation. How do you do it? Well, there's a number of different technologies, offshore wind being one of them. And the thing about offshore wind is it is one of the fastest and most certain resources that Delaware has to take advantage of right now. If you're talking about alternatives to offshore wind, these guys have been working on their project for 10 years. It's finally coming close to fruition. There's a few more details they're working out, but it's close. If you were to start to build a natural gas plant, a nuclear plant, put the environmental considerations aside, which you shouldn't, but even if that's not your primary concern, it still takes a long time to bring those big power plants online, years, in fact. If you look at the order books for natural gas turbines right now, which is arguably one of the most competitive technologies out there from a cost standpoint, it's 5 years minimum before you can get one if you put an order in today as a utility. And so that's about the time frame that U.S. Wind is looking at, about 5 years. And keep in mind, that's just ordering the natural gas turbine. That's not going through the permitting. That's not finding a buyer for your power. That's not plugging into the grid. So we're looking at serious cost concerns that can only be fixed by adding more generation. That's what U.S. Wind can provide. There's a lot more detail to go into, of course, but in short, that's how U.S. Wind is going to help stabilize electricity rates for folks here in Delaware.
Thank you. And I know when I had gotten brought into this work from Sierra Club, all the energy stuff was very new. It was a lot at one time. I do have an honest plug for you all. Sierra Club and some of our folks from other chapters have a whole PJM 101 webinar that is on our social media and our YouTube. To search up Sierra Club Delaware chapter, Delaware Sierra Club. It's right there for you to really learn some kind of basic stuff to really elaborate on what Evan was saying. But I will give Mike a chance to elaborate on what Evan was saying. So, Mike, I just want you to elaborate on kind of how will a project initiated by Maryland that some are saying will only deliver power to Maryland actually help power Delaware and lower rates in Delaware?
So there are 3 ways in which we'll affect rates here, and they all deal with different parts of the bill that you guys get from your utility. So the first, as I mentioned, U.S. Wind is going to give Delaware 150,000 free renewable energy credits each year. Now, Delaware, like most states now, has something called a renewable portfolio standard, which requires them to get a certain percentage of their energy each year from renewable resources. As Evan said, Delaware generates very little of its own power, and correspondingly very little of that is renewable as well. So to make up that difference, they go and they buy renewable energy credits from states or projects that have an excess of these, and they have to pay a certain amount for that, those credits. So giving them 150,000 free recs every year at a minimum is about $3.75 million worth of value to the state, a reduction in costs to the ratepayers. That's about 15% generally with where things are right now. The total cost of the recs that Delaware is buying year to year. On your bill, Generally, this is a couple dollars to us, so probably 15% of that goes down. Not a huge number, but it helps. The second area, which is much more impactful, is that all utilities have to arrange for emergency capacity, and they bid for this on a yearly basis. And what this really is an insurance policy to make sure that in times of extreme peak demand, like last January, there is a resource they can tap that will deliver more energy when they need it. And they arrange for the cost at the beginning of each cycle for a year, and then they pay that each month, and that gets passed through to us, the ratepayers. And US Wind, with the pricing from the last capacity auction, would save Delmarva Power and Light ratepayers $43 million a month, which is over $500 million a year, non-trivial amount. For what it's worth, when we did this analysis, we were looking at January, and in that month, PJM's total capacity costs were $46 million. So said differently, that reduces their capacity costs by 90%. The third and final way in which we affect pricing and what the costs are to ratepayers here is the actual power usage pricing. And again, as Evan was saying, just based upon the laws of supply and demand, and also from diversification, because Delaware is heavily reliant on natural gas, which is of course somewhat volatile these days for geopolitical reasons, as well as because it's being so heavily used. So by delivering more energy, we're just going to help in that way. But very specifically, during times of extreme heat or extreme cold, high demand, we're going to have a very outsized impact. And do you all remember back in January when it got really, really cold and everyone's bill went through the roof? So we know what our wind speeds are in our lease area hour by hour, and we have models that tell us how much our project would be generating if it were operational at that time. And so we know that answer. We thought it would be interesting to do an analysis to figure out how much we would have impacted ratepayer costs here in Delaware in January if our project had been operational. To do that on a power basis, you've got to rebuild the energy stack that DP&L would have been buying from each hour. So that's looking at what are all the sources they had available to them at that time, what did each one of those sources cost at that time. Super complicated, very expensive to model. So we picked 1 hour to model, and that was, if you're curious, 1 to 2 a.m. on January 24th. And while during this month, we were at a maximum capacity a lot of the time, it was a great month for wind, in that 1 hour, we were only producing about a third of our total output, about 660 megawatts. But even with that 660 megawatts, we would have saved ratepayers $1.43 million in that 1 hour. There are 743 other hours in January and 12 times that amount through the year. And look, in many of those hours, we won't have as big of an impact. Some of it will be very marginal. But in those periods of extreme heat or extreme cold, we will have a major impact. So that number over the course of the year, I think, is going to be quite large. So those are the 3 areas in which will make a difference.
Yeah, and I know you're not prepared for this, but you said something that piqued my interest. What time of day is offshore wind usually most productive?
So it tends to follow, this is really nice, the power curve tends to follow the usage curve here. So wind tends to blow a little bit stronger in the evenings than it does in the mornings or the afternoons. It does blow stronger in the winter, so we're going to have a greater impact then. And while it does blow less strong in the summer, we average in our lease area 25 mile per hour winds year round. And in that summertime, again, that power curve is kind of adjusting up as the day goes on. So as people are coming home from work, turning on their air conditioning at that time, turning on their TV, whatever, it's evenings when that power demand tends to ramp up, which fits that generation curve nicely.
And I might just add something to that. The old cliche, I'm sure you've all heard it. What happens when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, right? We've all heard it. Well, storage, yeah, definitely possible. But frankly, every single one of us relies on the power grid, right? It's this 13-state grid, and no single energy source, no matter what it is perfectly reliable. Even nuclear power plants, which are some of the most consistently available out there, they do have to go offline for maintenance up to a month at a time throughout the year. And so what does the grid do when that nuclear power plant goes down? It relies on the rest of the grid. And so to what Mike was saying about wind being available generally corresponding to when people in Delaware need it, means you'll see the benefits, but in the event that it's not producing, you still have that 13-state grid full of a ton of other power sources. So from that standpoint, it is very, very reliable. It's just as reliable as the lights we have in here today, and it's highly predictable. As Mike said, they can forecast very well what the wind is going to be, and that's actually cheaper to take into account from a reliability standpoint than if I'm just going to pick on nukes because I already talked about it. The nuclear power plant went offline because of offline because of a technical fault. And it had to shut down for 24 hours. That's very expensive because you weren't anticipating that. And you have to pay a lot to cover for it. You know when wind's going to be off because you can forecast the wind speed.
I appreciate y'all humoring me on that. And I hope y'all got something out of that too. It wasn't just a me question I hogged this up with. So moving on. So I know Delaware is unique in that we are one of the small number of states that are facing a double threat, both from the sinking land and a rising water table from sea level rise. For many of us, switching to cleaner energy is key in preventing the worst case scenario when it comes to climate change. So my question is, Danielle, could you name some of the impacts that we expect to see as a result of our changing weather patterns and flooding events? And how does transitioning to cleaner energy sources play a role in alleviating some of these impacts?
Yeah, I'll speak to kind of the wet side of global warming. That because I think that's we have the other side of it would be extreme temperatures, for example, or drought. But I think it's kind of I could spend like all night just talking about the wet aspects. If you think about the Earth as a system, simply put, we are seeing more water in the system as a result of warming temperatures, because as Christoph mentioned, warming temperatures leads to warmer oceans, which warmer water expands. And so in any kind of ocean or bay or tidal area, you're seeing high tides and low tides that are higher to begin with now, higher than they once were. And then you see in the adjacent wetlands, areas, wetlands are storing more water. Now, wetlands are phenomenal because they're meant to store and then discharge water each day with the coming tides. They're also great at accepting excess storm water, during a coastal storm. But if they have less capacity in them, then they'll be less able to do their terrific job of flood protection. Some of those plants will get overwhelmed, and we'll lose wetlands, and then we'll lose the sort of associated habitat that they provide and all the water quality benefits and the leisure benefits that wetlands provide. In addition, our water table is rising below ground, and that leads to concerns with saltwater intrusion into infrastructure, into our farmlands. We're seeing that farmland is being affected not only from saltwater intrusion into the water table, but also overland, salt water. So from storm surge or excess tides, you're seeing a loss of productive farmland in parts of our state and Delmarva. And think about our infrastructure, sort of the built infrastructure. In the lowest lying parts of the state, there are roads that are being really difficult to pass during especially high tides. You might have stormwater infrastructure that was designed for a climate of yesterday versus the climate of tomorrow. The diameter of the pipes and drainage just don't accommodate the heavy rains and storm surge that we expect. When I said that the system is holding more water, that's also because warmer oceans lead to more evaporation, which leads to more water in the atmosphere. And so we see intensifying storms. In the case of hurricanes, not so much that it's causing more hurricanes, but more intense hurricanes that can dump a lot of rain. We're also seeing a phenomenon of rapid intensification. Hurricane Milton last year, well, the Weather Service estimates that they classify intensification based on if a storm increases its wind speed more than 35 miles per hour in a 24-hour period. I think Hurricane Milton increased 95 miles per hour within a 24-hour period. It's really interesting, and that has all kinds of implications for evacuations and, giving people the appropriate lead time and the responders to kind of act and prepare for storms. So all that to say, I could go on too, because I could talk about erosion, and associated impacts there. So there's lots of varying impacts from that warming climate on our system. But then I want to say that, yes, in Delaware, we have a rate of sea level rise that's twice the global average. And that is due to a combination of factors, regional factors, including land subsidence and sort of the slackening of the currents. But if you think about it, over the past 100 years, we've had about just over a foot of sea level rise. But in the next 25 years, roughly 25 to 30 years, there's very high confidence in the science community that we here locally are going to see the same amount of increase, up close to 1.5 feet of sea level rise. So those tides are going to be higher, and then as the storm blows in, that storm surge and those effects will be built on top of that tide. What we can do, as far as we know that those effects are sort of baked into the system already. But there's going to be a more rapid acceleration starting mid-century as we go beyond. And we have an opportunity to rein in some of that warming to reduce that rate of acceleration through efforts like investing in renewable energies and controlling some of those emissions that are creating some of that warming. And why do that is because our menu of adaptation options is about this big, but it's going to start shrinking the further we go into the century, because as sea level rise accelerates and other effects take place with global warming, the choices available to us to mitigate and adapt to those is going to be less, and then those remaining options are going to probably be more costly. So now's the time to act while we have the fullest menu of options available, whatever it is, but now's the time to act.
Yeah, so I'm hearing the role that kind of cleaner energy sources plays kind of reducing that rate of warming. And I love that you talked kind of towards the end of the menu of options that we have. What climate adaptation measures do you think are realistic for Delaware's coastal areas and communities? And is there a discussion on how to finance them? I know that's always a sticking point. How are we going to pay for it? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I think because we are the lowest lying state, and I think there's not one community that's more than 8 or 10 miles from a tidal tributary in our state. It's why the federal government classifies the entire state as a coastal zone, actually. But we have to learn to live with water. So we're gonna have to learn to live with more water. And that means adapting by elevating our homes, our roadways, our infrastructure. It means learning to live with water. Maybe you're accessing properties by boat. Or think about in terms of that we have a vast system of nature-based resources, our wetlands, our riparian areas like a river, we have our beaches, but they're all playing a role in helping to protect us from excess rain and excess storm surge. Nature is best at fighting nature. And if we can invest more in our nature-based solutions, I think we'll have a chance at really, adapting to some of these effects more successfully. And that may mean trying to restore more of the natural floodplain. Nature gave us that for free. It's a form of infrastructure, community-based infrastructure, that is pulling double duty, triple duty in terms of the benefits it gives to us. But we have built upon it or built up to it. And then when we kind of reduce some of its function, we pay millions of dollars in built infrastructure to replicate. And I think if we just think about converting spaces back to the floodplain over time, we'll be able to accommodate more of these changes. Lastly, or maybe two more quick points is I think we've got to also prepare for the big disasters and the smaller scale disasters. We can't assume that just because we haven't had a big scale event in Delaware that we won't see one. We actually are seeing, it's observed, we are seeing more severe weather in our state. And we have more people and more infrastructure in the path of that flooding than we did before. So I think we have to take steps to prepare our communities and plan. And then finally, investing in renewable energy, I think, is a logical step, because we have to slow that rate of acceleration, so that we can give ourselves a chance, a foothold in this adaptation effort.
Yeah, and I love that you made a point about like we need to prepare for things. A really close friend of mine lives in Asheville, North Carolina, and when Hurricane Helene hit, I remember hearing folks saying people come here when hurricanes hit. They go to the mountains when hurricanes hit, and they were not prepared. And I think from what you're saying, we need to really think, even though we haven't had that hit yet, how do we prepare for that? So I love that you're thinking through that. Moving on a little bit. So the current federal administration has shown a desire to slow down and even stop the development of offshore wind. So this is probably me for Mike. How will federal policy changes continue to impact offshore wind development off the coast of Delaware? And what impact will that have on our energy system more broadly? Right here.
2 mics.
3 mics.
3 mics.
If you parse what is being put out there by the administration, I think it's fair to anticipate that there will not be any more lease areas auctioned off for the next 4 years. I think it's also likely that those projects that are in process right now, but are not fully permitted, are probably not going to get fully permitted in the next 4 years. I think it's likely that those activities will be slow walked for some time. Now, there are 2 lease areas off the coast of Delaware. One that many of you are probably familiar with that is controlled by Ørsted. Ørsted gave back their awards, so they currently don't have any. And there's another lease area that's east of Ørsted. It's controlled by Equinor, I believe. Those 2 lease areas, Delaware has the ability now to launch a procurement program, and they could launch one, and those 2 lease areas would be in good position to bid on that program. So Delaware could initiate a project for the state. However, as I said, it's unlikely that project's going to get too far along in the next 4 years. Now, what will that do, regionally and locally? I mean, we've talked about that AI, data centers, and the like are vastly increasing the demand for energy. A lot of studies that I've seen suggest in the next 10 years, you're going to see a 50% increase in the need for capacity, a 30% increase in the need for just generation. And if you look at all of the natural gas projects and all of the restarted nuclear projects that are in the queue over that period of time, they don't come close to meeting that forecasted new demand.
And the queue is the line of projects waiting to plug into the grid.
They're known right now. And as Evan mentioned, if you wanted to do a natural gas project, well, the orders for the turbines that are necessary are 5 years out. But fortunately, there are lots and lots of renewable projects that could come online during that period of time. So the bottom line is that to meet our expected future demand, we're going to have to do it with renewables as a big part of that. Now, for the East Coast, offshore wind is really the best form of utility scale renewable energy we can use, because for solar farms, you generally need vast areas or super concentrated sunlight like you would get in the desert. For onshore wind, you need open plains, you need mountaintops, things like that we don't have here in Delaware and really along much of the East Coast, but you do have access to offshore wind. So that really should be a big part of it. And we'll have to see how that all plays out. Now, in terms of our own project, I think if you look right now, it's a fair assumption that the administration is allowing projects that are fully permitted to continue on. There are 5 offshore wind projects along the East Coast that are under construction right now. We are also fully permitted. And we feel pretty confident internally because in addition to having an offshore wind project, we are unique amongst our peers in that our project also includes the construction of a tubular steel manufacturing facility in Baltimore. So 1,000 or so construction jobs and 600 full-time steelworker jobs. And that facility also includes a dry dock that can be used for repairing bridges. For example, it likely will be used as a part of the Key Bridge rebuild. We've had questions from defense contractors, Coast Guard for using it as a vessel repair dry dock or even a vessel build dry dock. And those are all components that are important to this administration, manufacturing and American shipbuilding. So I think that there are a lot of assets that our company brings or that our project brings along that would sync up with what this administration says that it's interested in. So we'll have to see, but there are still some good possibilities that are out there.
Thank you. And Evan, do you want to elaborate on any kind of parts of that on kind of impacts on our energy system more broadly from offshore wind development?
I think Mike summed it up between that and my earlier comments pretty well.
All righty. Well, thank you to our panelists. This is that part where I said y'all will get to stretch your legs, stretch your jaw a little bit if you want to talk to your neighbor about what you learned. There are note cards under your seats, or not Oprah, but like they were on your seats when you sat down. Happy to hand out more pencils for you to write down questions. Remember, as I said earlier, if you could just summarize what your question is about in kind of 3 different words, we will consolidate those and we'll be back in about 5-ish minutes. All right? All right.
Oh.
Functions and what it does. But you can find there our construction and operations plan, which can really answer any question you would have about the project. It goes into, where are things coming from, how are they developed, how are they transported from where they'll be built to the project itself, how will they be installed. It identifies all the potential risks that our project could take on through the actions that we'll take, and importantly, what we will do to either avoid or mitigate those risks. It talks about the research that we've either conducted ourselves or have reviewed in putting together our plans, and footnotes all of those resources so you can go and look at them yourselves. So within that guide, you can see, of course, layouts of the turbines. So as I mentioned, there will be 114 now based on the 3 different awards that we received from the state of Maryland. They're spaced roughly a mile apart, east, west, and north, south, 80,000 acre lease area, and that also includes 4 offshore substations. So we're going to develop this in 4 phases, starting from the most southeasterly spot and then building forward. Each phase will have its own offshore substation, which would aggregate all of the power from the 30 or so turbines that would be a part of that phase, and then send that power to the coast through an export cable. So then 4 export cables would come to the coast. But that's the best source for that information. It also does include visual simulations that we developed under BOEM's very specific guidance. And there are 2 technologies that are used. One is a panoramic view, and that best reflects the human experience from the beach. If you were standing there looking out, what would you see? And they're taken from various points from Ocean City, from Bethany, from the Rehoboth Boardwalk, and different places like that. There's also what's called a single frame detail, which BOEM had us develop because they were getting comments from people that they couldn't really see the turbines, and they wanted to know the detail of what they would look like. So the single frame detail reflect what you would see if you look through a 35 millimeter camera focused specifically on the wind farm itself. So if you look at and they'll often have both technologies at the same shot, you look at one to the other, you can kind of see a zooming effect, but those 2 sets of turbines will give you a good sense, or those 2 sets of simulations will give you a good sense of what they'll look like. The bottom line is that the closest turbine to each of our beaches around here, to Fenwick Island, is 11 miles fully built out. To Bethany is 13 miles, 20 miles to Dewey, 22 to Rehoboth, and about 30 to get up to our state park beaches around here. So when you get past Bethany, they'll be very hard to see. I mean, I never want to shortchange it. There will be something really tiny on the horizon. It will be different than it was, but on a high humidity day in the summer from Dewey and Rehoboth, they're going to be very hard to see. Okay, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM.gov. And if you look at it, it's listed as the Maryland offshore wind project. And in addition to the construction operations plan, you can also find the environmental impact statements and the visual simulations and all kinds of other goodies associated with the project.
Perfect. Next question, and this might be a really short one. Why not onshore wind in Western Sussex versus offshore?
Sure. I'll take this one. So Merrick Action does represent land-based wind developers as well. I'd say there's probably two primary reasons for it. One is that the visual impacts, folks may have concerns about that with land-based wind because it's much closer, obviously, than 11 miles offshore. But if you don't care about the visual impacts, one of the other reasons is that the transmission grid coming onto Delmarva, if you think about how we build out our electric wires to supply consumers, you can kind of think about it like a pipe that gets narrower as there's less need for the electricity. And so when you come from, starting at the top, Philly, Newcastle County, you come down Delmarva, there's fewer and fewer consumers as you go farther down Delmarva Peninsula. And so the wires get smaller and smaller as you go down the peninsula. And so when you look down here at the southern part of the peninsula, there's really not a lot of room on the grid to have land-based resources plug in there. That's why Indian River is the place that they're connecting US Winds project, because there is actually some room on the grid there. But aside from that, you might need to see some investment in the land-based grid in order to see more land-based wind turbines. They do have some good advantages, I'll say, vis-a-vis solar. They don't use as much land as solar does because you can farm right up to the base of the turbine. Solar is a good resource too. It's all got to be part of the mix. And a balance, I think, of these different resources plus our existing electricity supply is really the best outcome for the state.
Alrighty, and I've made the executive decision to jump between the different topics, so we absolutely get to each and every one. So we're gonna move on to ecosystem. So what impacts is there on commercial or recreational fisheries? Talking about horseshoe crabs and all that stuff, and how do we minimize those impacts?
So when we're talking about impact on resources, there's the offshore impacts. And I think folks have probably read enough and seen enough to know that there are concerns about turbines spinning and impacts on birds, for example. And I'm not going to speak to that because that's not our bailiwick, but there are other panelists who could speak better to that. There are also then potential impacts to marine mammals. And so there's a lot of concern if you have strandings of whales or dolphins, porpoises in our area. Concerns, is that something related to the offshore wind effort? And again, others can address that better than us. On the bay side, on the inshore side, a lot of concerns about horseshoe crabs. And so one of the things that our scientific and technical advisory committee did look at were potential impacts, not only horseshoe crabs, but on blue crabs, on flounder, on the other fish and creatures that inhabit our inland bays. Fortunately, the impacts of the dredging project and the installation of those cables and the operation of those cables is going to have a minimal impact on those creatures. They're fairly mobile. Horseshoe crabs don't look like they are, but if they have a motivation, they can scoot. And you probably have stepped on one. You notice that they all of a sudden have an ability to move. And so the same with, of course, the fish and others. There are some creatures like hard clams and oysters, if we had them, that could be affected by a project like this going through the bays. Our work at the center is to make sure that we have much more of those in our bays than we have right now. The bays used to be replete with oysters and oyster reefs. They used to be a hazard to navigation. They're virtually gone. So, one of the big things that we're doing is trying to restore populations of wild oysters, working with the aquaculture industry to create the kinds of oysters that you can enjoy when you go to the restaurant. And take my word for it, Rehoboth Bay oysters are a heck of a lot better than anything else you're going to get. And it's the truth. So anyway, you see them on the menu, grab them. We're hoping to take those 9 farmers and expand that number over time. So, but anyway, minimizing the impacts is something that Mike has talked a little bit about, that the company has taken a lot of look at, done a lot of work with their consultants to assess what's out there, what would be potentially impacted, and the way they're going about this project. And one of the things that we took into consideration very carefully is the way that the project is being done. The other thing I will say for context, the bays have historically had a lot of this kind of disturbance. People have their boats, like to have their navigable channels, and so dredging for navigation is an historic reality in our bays. This will be basically the equivalent of that, and again, would be short-term impacts.
Yeah, I will do that. So usually the questions that I get are about environmental impacts, and so I could honestly talk on this for several hours. I will not. I'll just try to hit a couple points really quickly to address what I'm sure are concerns in the room. So first of all, let's start with whales and marine mammals. The risk to those animals is during construction, particularly when we are hammering in the monopile foundations. That does produce very loud noises that can be harmful to a whale if they experience that sound at a point where it is still at a threshold that could cause injury, which is generally above 185 decibels. So the way that we do this is the whole process is set up to ensure that no whales or marine mammals are within those ranges where they would experience sound at a harmful level. So this starts by the fact that we will only be doing construction offshore during times of the year when whales are least likely to be here, which is generally, late spring to early fall. Second thing is that we set up a couple perimeters. So there is a shutdown zone.
If I can have your attention, please. The library will be closing in 15 minutes.
I better tighten this up. There's a 2.9 kilometer shutdown zone and a 5 kilometer clearance zone. And you have, as you're doing this work, on every vessel, NOAA certified third-party protected species observers who control the process. And they use visual and acoustic technology to evaluate that 5 kilometer range to make sure that there are no marine mammals in that area for a full contiguous 30 minutes before you start actually hammering in those monopiles. When it starts, it begins with a tapping, what's called a soft start, which produces sound but at non-harmful levels. So if there are marine mammals close to that 5 kilometer radius, they generally will swim further away. We do that for another 30 minutes, and then the hammering begins in earnest. It generally takes about 2 hours. We're only allowed to do one per day. The protected species observers continue to use all their technology, and you'll have passive acoustic monitors all the way through that range, around the perimeters of the clearance zone, around the perimeters of the shutdown zone. So if they start to observe marine mammals swimming toward the clearance zone, they're going to watch them very closely. To get inside that clearance zone, they will shut it down. And so between the shutdown zone and the clearance zone, the sound levels at that point are expected to be non-injury producing, but behavior changing. Typically, that means they will swim away. But one of the things that we will do that's a new step in this industry, and it'll become standard, is that 2.9 kilometer zone and 5 kilometer zone were based upon modeled sound. What we believe it's going to be based upon the characteristics of the sea bottom, everything that's out there. But we're going to have monitors set up the whole time, and we'll be checking that in real time so that if sound is not dissipating as quickly as we thought it was, we will expand those zones and begin the process over. So, and there's some other things that go around that, but again, the intent is to make sure that no animal is exposed to sound that's going to be harmful. Fisheries, I can just say quickly, every study that I have read shows that the fishery after an offshore wind project was built was more diverse and at greater biomass. It tends to be helpful. These foundations and the rock scour protection at the bottom form artificial reefs. They attract fish life, and it isn't just that they aggregate it. Generations of fish start to thrive there. Our particular lease area, there's 30-some lease areas along the East Coast. We're like third from the bottom in terms of fisheries landing. So there is commercial fishing that's out there, relatively not as much as in the other spaces. But of course, to those dozen or so people, that's their livelihood, and it really matters to them, and I get their anxiety. But the great majority of the fishing that's done out there is fixed gear, meaning they drop pots on the bottom, they come back and get them a couple days later. It's going to be very easy for them to continue this type of fishing, and the species that they're going for love structure. So we believe it's going to be better for them when all is said and done. But again, I completely understand their anxiety in the process. And I'll stop talking because there's other questions you want to get
Yeah. All right, we're gonna do this rapid fire. I'm talking like, give me 5 words. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna walk around, so I'm just gonna give you all the mic. How does tidal compare to offshore wind?
How does what?
Tidal energy?
I'll just say tidal energy is much more sort of early stage. It hasn't been commercialized. Offshore wind exists in Europe. It exists in Asia. There's actually 3 operating projects in the U.S. today, 5 more under construction.
Groovy, love that. Okay, is there a storage component to offshore wind?
There can be. It doesn't have to be directly connected to the project. As long as you have energy storage on the grid, it can pull the electrons off the grid, including from wind, and store it and use it later.
Will there be grants and training for workforce development offered through the project?
So yeah, U.S. Wind is funding workforce development programs that will be developed in the area. I'm not sure about what the cost will be for those programs, but we will pay for their development.
Do we know where the other utilities stand on the projects, like DEC or DP&L?
I can't.
Okay.
I cannot.
Yeah, I think that because the contractual relationship with the project is with Maryland utilities, really the impact on Delaware utilities is that they will have more wholesale electricity available to buy, which means that the rates will not be as high when they are procuring energy off the wholesale market, which then translates into retail rates that you all pay as Delaware homeowners.
Groovy. Will there be extra capacity for new generation and upgraded lines?
That would be something that I think you would have to see further investments in the grid beyond U.S. Wind's project. They've made the investments to upgrade the grid. I think if you're talking about like the 2nd and 3rd offshore wind projects or other resources like solar beyond the projects that are already out there, you'd probably be looking at some grid upgrades.
Nice, nice. Are the turbines always on? How do they handle storms?
So they generally need about 15-mile-per-hour winds to efficiently function, and they can function up until I believe it's about 70-mile-an-hour per winds. Beyond that, they shut down. But they have the ability to protect themselves. So the blades turn and they would feather into the wind. The faces would turn into the storm. And the OEMs that we're looking at, the turbines that we're evaluating are rated to be able to withstand a direct hit from a Category 4 hurricane, which we've never had in this area before. We've only had 2 that were Category 3 when they got here. Everything else has been Category 2. Now, of course, we expect that to increase over time. But yeah, the foundations themselves should have no problem. It's possible you would have some blade damage in a storm, like a 3 or a 4 hit it. But we would expect those turbines to be still functional and work well, and just with some maintenance, be able to get back and going again.
Nice. I love that you're listening to Danielle and planning for the future. How do the operating O&M, so I'm assuming it's how do the operating and management cost compared to other technologies?
This question's for me?
No, I was saying I'm glad that they were listening to you by planning for the future of climate change for the Category 4.
I can, I can't do the relative comparison. What I would say is that the cost of an offshore wind plant is heavily front loaded. It's many $1 billion to build one. Once you've done that, maintaining them is actually, decimal dust by comparison. And they do tend to hold up very well. They've got 35 years of history out in Europe to look back on and see how they've done. But it's not the big cost in the whole thing. How that compares to other forms of energy, though, I do not know.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. I mean, for a future wind project beyond U.S. Wind that might contract with Delaware potentially under the legislation that passed, I think it was last year, one of the advantages of having Delaware actually contract for that energy is that it provides stability. There is that big upfront investment. You pay that off over the course of a contract, but every day you all are subject to what's happening, with the Henry Hub price for natural gas, and what is the demand doing to the price of natural gas, which then translates to electricity bills downstream. So the fact that offshore wind has no fuel, the wind is free, allows you to have a very clear idea of what your costs are going to be over the course of the project.
I love that we're talking about cost. What is the profit motive for US Wind, given so much investment? Are the lease payments forever or a specific time? Can you talk more about that?
So yeah, the lease payments are for as long as we would be out there. And for the record, we also are charged with funding the removal of all the infrastructure when the project is at end of life, and we will post bonds to make sure that there's money there regardless of what happens to US Wind. Wait, sorry, what was the question again, Marissa?
Profit motive. Yeah, profit motive.
Yeah, so as the developer bids on their project, they've got to look at the whole life cycle of costs and project what that's going to be, have some buffer in there to make sure that you're not underbidding yourself, and you know what your revenues are going to be. That's the positive side, because it's expensive to build, so no one builds these things on spec. You've got to have a long-term power purchase agreement in place. So if the project is running, we know how much it'll earn, what you've got to forecast what the cost will be. And if you do this well, then you've figured out how to make a profit as you do that. What some people saw recently was offshore wind projects running into a problem when capital costs went way up. Interest rates went way up, and so the cost of financing them became way more expensive. And then the cost of steel went up considerably as well, as that factored into some things. We're fortunate the way that our project is priced. We're comfortable that this project is going to be able to operate profitably through its life.
And I might just add something to that. So Delaware is what's called the deregulated electricity market. So competitive suppliers of electricity, generators like US Wind, have to compete for whether it's a state contract like they have through Maryland or on the wholesale market. And that does protect consumers, because the alternative to that would be to have a regulated utility monopoly, and they charge a certain rate of return that you all have to pay. In the case of the New Jersey projects, which that you mentioned did not pencil out, ultimately they had a contract with the state that, because of inflation, these things they could not meet the terms of, and so that project went away. Ratepayers didn't pay for it. They weren't going to pay, and Maryland ratepayers won't pay until the electrons start getting produced in the wind farm. That's actually a really good thing for consumers, because it means you're not out any money unless you're actually getting something, for the cost.
Yeah, all right, two more. What expert and objective entity will be regularly inspecting the equipment and functioning of the wind infrastructure?
So the first and foremost is BESI, which is kind of BOEM's sister organization that engages on safety and is making sure that everything is being handled properly, that the maintenance is being kept up to speed, and that the turbines are set to function in all environments. We have contracts for spill responses, things like that. So you've got an infrastructure to support it, but it's primarily BESI in terms of providing oversight. Evan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered it.
Yeah. There is a federal agency whose job it is to make sure that these things are being maintained.
I love the dog names. You got Noah, you got Bessie, you got Noah. Last question. What are the impacts of this project on the birds in the Atlantic flyway?
So the Mid-Atlantic flyway, fortunately, is far closer to shore than our project is. So as those passerines are coming through this area, they will not be out in our project area unless a bird made a horrible mistake. Now there are marine birds that do live out there, and many live out there all the time. But every 2 years, there's a census done, and if you look at that construction and operation plan, there's an appendix which will show you by month, by species, counts of the birds that are out there. And on average, through the course of the year, in our 80,000 acre lease area, there are 15 marine birds. So it's not a high area of density. And what folks have seen, the experience in European wind farms, is that because these birds can see the structures far, far away, unlike being on land and having obstructed views, they just tend to avoid them. And that, of course, it has its own problematic areas. If that was where they fished, they now need to go someplace else. But in terms of impacts for the turbines, we don't anticipate that being a problem.
I might just add to that. This is, I think, maybe a good way to wrap up something earlier you said, Mike. So obviously, you talk a lot about marine impacts to species. You talk about bird impacts. I think what's really important to note is that Mike knew all that stuff off the top of his head because they've thought deeply about the environmental impacts of these projects. It's not something that's been done, quickly. They've been studied for 10 years. This project, the lease area, And now the project itself has been studied for over a decade, almost exhaustively, to deconflict the ocean to the greatest extent possible in the place where they're building this project. That wasn't put there by accident. Sometimes people say, like, why is it 11 miles offshore as opposed to 20? Well, because that part of the ocean was deconflicted through a federal process, understanding where fishing grounds are, where shipping lanes are, where national security impacts are, where marine mammals tend to congregate, where the benthic environment is sensitive. Like, they have spent so much time looking at this stuff, and no infrastructure project is free of impacts, right? Every single thing we do, building a house, building a road, building a coal-fired power plant, building a wind farm, it has an impact. But I feel confident that because of the strong amount of effort that has been put into studying this project, that it is a reasonable trade-off, the impacts that it will have for the clean energy that it will provide and the cost savings that it will provide. And so I think it's just really important to put that in context, because I used to work for the land-based wind industry before even this job, and I still represent it. The birds thing comes up all the time. And I think it's just important to note that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, notes about 230,000 birds are killed each year by wind turbines across the country. So how many wind turbines are there? Sounds like a big number, right? There are over 100,000 wind turbines in the United States. That's like maybe one bird a year per wind turbine, which also may still sound like a lot of birds, but when you think about glass building impacts, car impacts, I mean, there are billions, literally hundreds of millions of birds killed by glass buildings every year. And so I think it's just important to put that all in context. I don't mean to, beat a dead horse on that, but I think it's yeah.
Yes, one last thing, I would love to be the person doing the bird census going nest to nest. That is all. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a lovely evening. Please get home safely. Feel free to come up and ask some questions.
That was a good point, though.
Yeah, I think it's really important. Yeah.
Please come see me.
About what?
Yes.
What?
Josh, guys.
Of course.
They said it's closed.
I'm good with that. That was done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good seeing you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll be able to go through